Officer James Crowley had spent the last 10 years patrolling the suburban streets of Greenfield, a quiet neighborhood that in his mind was his to control. He wore his badge like a crown, believing it gave him absolute authority. His record was spotless, on paper. In reality, whispers followed him wherever he went. The Black and Latino residents of Greenfield knew better than to cross his path. He wasn't the type to plant evidence or get physical without reason, but he had a pattern. He stopped cars driven by black men more often than not. He eyed young Latino boys at bus stops like they were suspects before they were even old enough to shave. And whenever a black woman walked with her head held high, with confidence that didn't shrink under his gaze, it set something off in him. Tonight was no different. He had stopped at a small convenience store for an energy drink, needing something to shake off the exhaustion of his shift. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the soft hum of the refrigerators filled the otherwise quiet space. James was leaning against the cold glass of the refrigerated section, scanning the aisles lazily, when the automatic doors slid open with a faint whoosh. The cold night air rushed in, carrying with it Colonel Monica Lewis. She walked in with a quiet authority, her back straight, her shoulders squared, her gaze steady. She didn't need to announce who she was. Her presence did it for her. Dressed in her deep green Army service uniform, adorned with medals and ribbons that spoke of decades of service, sacrifice, and leadership, she was a woman who had spent her life defending the very freedoms Crowley claimed to protect. But James didn't see that. He didn't see the years of dedication, the deployments, or the sacrifices. All he saw was a black woman moving with too much confidence. Something about it made him uncomfortable. It was in the way she carried herself, the way she didn't flinch under the eyes of others. To him, that kind of presence in a woman like her was a challenge, a silent defiance he wasn't prepared to accept. His fingers tightened around the can of his energy drink as he watched her move through the store. She barely acknowledged him, barely seemed to notice him at all. That, more than anything, gnawed at him. He had spent years making sure people like her noticed him, respected him, feared him. And yet, here she was, treating him like he was just another face in the store. A cashier behind the counter stole a glance at Monica, her eyes flickering between admiration and curiosity. A few other customers milled about, unaware of the weight shifting in the room. To them, Monica was just another customer. To Crowley, she was something else. He exhaled sharply, trying to shake the feeling creeping up his spine. He told himself it was just a normal night, just another stop in his routine. But deep down, he knew the truth. Something about Monica Lewis had already set his blood running cold, and he didn't even know why. Colonel Monica Lewis wasn't looking for trouble. After a long day, all she wanted was a bottle of water and a protein bar before heading home. The automatic doors of the small convenience store slid open with a quiet whoosh as she stepped inside. The blast of cold evening air followed her, sending a small chill through the store before the doors sealed shut behind her. She moved with effortless authority, the kind that didn't need an introduction. Years of service had ingrained discipline into every step she took, every glance she made. Her deep green Army service uniform was immaculate, her medals and ribbons gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights. She was used to being stared at, sometimes with admiration, sometimes with curiosity, but she didn't care much for either. Tonight, she just wanted to pay for her things and leave. The store was relatively quiet. A mother and her young son stood near the snack aisle, the child clutching a bag of chips while she fished through her purse for change. A middle-aged man was grabbing a six-pack from the fridge, and a teenager in a hoodie stood near the counter, scrolling through his phone. The cashier, a young woman with tired eyes, glanced up and momentarily stiffened at the sight of Monica's uniform before quickly returning to scanning a customer's items. One pair of eyes, however, lingered too long. Officer James Crowley was already in the store, standing near the refrigerated drinks. He had been minding his own business, sipping on an energy drink, when Monica walked in. The second he saw her, something shifted in his expression. His grip around the can in his hand tightened, his jaw tensed. He wasn't seeing a decorated Army colonel. He wasn't seeing a war veteran who had dedicated her life to defending her country. He was seeing a black woman in uniform, walking with confidence he didn't think she should have. Monica barely glanced his way as she made her way toward the register, reaching into her pocket to retrieve her wallet. It was a simple, unconscious motion, one she had done 1,000 times before. But to Crowley, it was something else. His body reacted before his brain could catch up. His fingers twitched, his pulse quickened. His hand instinctively dropped to the holster at his hip. Time seemed to slow. For him, logic didn't matter. He didn't think. He only saw what he wanted to see. "Freeze! Hands where I can see them!" The sharp command shattered the silence in the store. The young cashier gasped, dropping the item she was scanning. The mother near the snack aisle let out a startled yelp, instinctively pulling her son behind her. The man grabbing beer from the fridge whipped his head around, his eyes wide with shock. Monica barely had time to register the sound before she saw the gun pointed at her. A cold, unsettling calm washed over her. This wasn't her first time facing a weapon. But this was different. This wasn't a battlefield. This was home. And yet here she was. The air in the store turned heavy, suffocating with tension. The teenager near the counter slowly lifted his phone, pressing record. Other customers did the same, their cameras now focused on Crowley and the weapon in his hands. But he wasn't looking at them. His gun was raised, his stance rigid, his chest rising and falling in quick bursts. He was breathing too fast, his hands were steady. For now. Crowley's voice was sharp, but beneath it there was something else. Fear. The store was frozen in a moment of disbelief. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerators and the heavy breathing of Officer James Crowley, whose hands gripped his gun with rigid intensity. His eyes were locked onto Colonel Monica Lewis, his finger hovering dangerously close to the trigger. Monica, however, didn't move. She had been in countless high-pressure situations before, had stared down the barrels of guns in combat zones, had led soldiers through life-or-death decisions. But this wasn't war. This wasn't an enemy combatant. This was an American police officer pointing a weapon at her in her own country. Her hands were still mid-motion, her wallet half pulled from her pocket. The simple act of reaching for her money had turned into a life-threatening moment, all because of one man's assumptions. Crowley's breath came short and fast. He wasn't thinking. He was reacting. His mind had already filled in the blanks with a reality that wasn't real. A black woman reaching into her pocket wasn't a customer buying a bottle of water. It was a potential suspect reaching for a weapon. It was a narrative he had told himself over and over again throughout his career, a pattern ingrained so deeply that he didn't even question it. The store remained deadly silent. A woman near the snack aisle clutched her young son, pulling him behind her as if shielding him from what could happen next. The cashier's hands trembled on the counter, her lips parted in shock. A man by the beer fridge stood frozen, eyes darting between Crowley and Monica, as if waiting for something to snap. And then, click. The soft sound of a phone camera recording broke through the silence. The teenager in the hoodie, barely moving, had lifted his phone just enough to capture the entire event. He wasn't alone. Other customers were pulling out their phones too, cameras raised, recording every second. The red recording light blinked, unwavering. Monica took a slow breath, her voice calm, measured. In control. "You're pointing a weapon at a United States Army colonel, officer." Her words landed like a hammer. For a brief moment, something flickered in Crowley's eyes. His gaze darted to the polished silver eagle insignia on her uniform, the glint of medals on her chest. A realization clawed at the edge of his consciousness, but his pride, his instinct to assert control, wouldn't let him lower the gun. Because now it wasn't just about what he thought he saw. Now it was about proving he wasn't wrong. "I said put your hands where I can see them." He barked again, but the sharpness of his voice had cracked just slightly, betraying his uncertainty. Monica didn't flinch. She tilted her head slightly, studying him. She had seen this before, not just in enemy soldiers, but in young recruits on their first deployment, gripping their rifles too tight, mistaking their own fear for control. The only difference was that this wasn't a battlefield. Crowley's chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. He could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on him, the heat of dozens of eyes watching, judging. And still, he refused to lower his weapon. The tension in the store was suffocating, pressing down on everyone like a heavy storm cloud ready to break. Officer James Crowley stood rigid, his gun raised, his pulse hammering in his ears. The longer he kept the weapon pointed at Colonel Monica Lewis, the more the situation spiraled beyond his control. And control was everything to him. But for the first time, he felt it slipping through his fingers. Monica, however, remained still, her hands visible, her posture relaxed but unshaken. Her training had taught her that fear could cloud judgment, that in moments like these, power often lay in remaining calm. She didn't just see Crowley, she read him. The tightness in his jaw, the white-knuckled grip on his gun, the way his chest rose and fell too quickly. He wasn't thinking, he was reacting. But the world was watching now. The quiet clicks of phone cameras filled the store, tiny red recording lights blinking like beacons of truth. A teenager near the refrigerators held his phone steady, his face tense. A mother by the snack aisle shook her head in disgust. A man near the beer fridge muttered under his breath, his expression hard. They all saw the same thing. They saw an officer who had drawn his weapon on a black woman who had done nothing wrong. Crowley knew it too, but pride was a dangerous thing. Monica took a slow, deliberate breath before speaking, her voice even unshaken. "You saw what you wanted to see, officer." The words cut through the tension like a blade. Crowley's fingers twitched against the grip of his gun. His mind scrambled for justification, for a reason to hold his ground. He wanted to say she had moved too fast. He wanted to claim he had felt threatened. He wanted to reach for the same excuses he had used 100 times before. But they would all be lies, and for the first time he felt the weight of them. Monica took a step forward. Just one. Crowley flinched. His grip faltered for a fraction of a second, just enough for Monica to see it. She had been in war zones before, had stood before men with far more reason to shoot her than Crowley had now. And yet none of them had ever looked as terrified as he did in that moment. The fear in his eyes wasn't of her, it was of the consequences. The videos would spread, the headlines would write themselves. There wouldn't be an officer's version of events because the evidence was already rolling. Still, he hesitated, his breath came fast and uneven. Monica's voice dropped lower, sharper. "I've spent my life defending this country, including you. And this is how you treat me." A murmur rippled through the store. The mother near the snacks let out a scoff. The cashier clutched the edge of the counter, her knuckles turning white. Crowley swallowed hard. His hands started to shake. For the first time, he felt the weight of his own stupidity, his recklessness, his failure. But it was too late to take it back. The only choice left was whether he would double down or finally face the truth. And everyone was waiting to see which one he'd choose. The weight of the moment pressed down on Officer James Crowley like a crushing tide. His hands trembled, barely perceptible at first, but Monica Lewis saw it. She saw everything. The way his jaw tightened, the flicker of doubt in his eyes, the way his grip on the gun was no longer firm, no longer confident. And yet he still didn't lower it. The store had turned into a silent courtroom, with the customers acting as both witnesses and jury. Every phone in the room was pointed at him, recording his downfall in real time. The red blinking lights of the cameras weren't just capturing what was happening, they were cementing his fate. A voice broke through the silence, cutting like a knife. "Man, put the gun down. We all saw what happened." It was the teenager by the refrigerators, his phone still steady, his tone unshaken. The quiet murmur of the crowd grew louder. A woman near the entrance let out a disgusted scoff. The older man by the beer fridge muttered under his breath, shaking his head. "This is some damn shameful stuff." Crowley's heart pounded so hard it felt like it was trying to break free from his chest. He could feel it, the shift in the room, the realization that there was no way out of this. The public had turned against him, and when the public turned, there was no coming back. His mind raced, searching for an escape. He could still try to justify it, say she moved too fast, say he was just being cautious. But the words tasted like ash before he could even form them. The cameras had caught everything. There was no rewriting this story. And worse, he knew it. Monica took another step forward, her presence unwavering, her gaze locked onto his. She could tear him apart right now, humiliate him in front of the world, make sure he never wore that badge again. But she didn't, because she didn't have to. Crowley was unraveling all on his own. His breathing grew more uneven, the gun suddenly feeling wrong in his hands. Heavy, foreign, as if it no longer belonged to him. Or maybe it never should have. Monica's voice was softer now, but sharper than ever. "I could have been dead right now, because of you." Her words landed like a punch to the gut. Crowley's vision blurred at the edges, his fingers twitched, his grip slackening. For years he had pulled people over, demanded ID, reached for his gun first, and no one had ever told him, in such simple, undeniable words, what that power meant. But now he couldn't escape it. The store was silent, but the message was loud. Monica tilted her head slightly, pressing him one last time. "Tell me, officer, what exactly did you see?" It was a simple question, but it shattered him. Did he see a threat, a suspect, a reason to pull his gun, or did he just see what he wanted to see? Crowley's throat tightened. He had no answer, because everyone already knew the truth. The silence in the store was deafening. Officer James Crowley stood frozen, his grip on the gun wavering, his mind spinning in 1,000 different directions. The words from Colonel Monica Lewis still hung in the air like an inescapable truth. "Tell me, officer, what exactly did you see?" His pulse pounded against his temples, his mouth was dry, his throat felt like sandpaper. He wanted to answer, to explain, to justify, but there was nothing left to say. Because the truth was already out. The teenager near the refrigerators still held his phone up, recording every second. The mother in the snack aisle clutched her son tighter, shaking her head in disgust. The man by the beer fridge muttered under his breath, scoffing at the pathetic display before him. Crowley had spent years carrying himself like an untouchable force, like the law itself. But right now, with every pair of eyes in the store locked onto him, he felt smaller than he ever had before. And he hated it. But hatred wouldn't change the reality of what was happening. For the first time since he had drawn his weapon, his hands began to shake, noticeably this time. Monica saw it. So did everyone else. He could no longer hide behind his authority, his badge, his uniform. His power was crumbling, and everyone in the room knew it. The automatic doors suddenly slid open, letting in the sharp wail of distant sirens. 2 uniformed officers stepped inside, their faces tense, scanning the scene before them. Sergeant Robert Harris locked eyes with Crowley, then glanced at the raised phones, the stunned expressions, the trembling gun still clutched in Crowley's hands. He didn't need to ask what had happened, he already knew. Crowley swallowed hard, a cold sweat breaking out along his hairline. "Hand over your weapon." The command was quiet but absolute. Crowley's fingers twitched. Every instinct in his body screamed at him to resist, to argue, to fight. But fight for what? His reputation? His pride? His lies? He felt the crushing weight of his own mistakes, pressing down on him, suffocating him. He had lost. Slowly, with a breath that felt like defeat itself, Crowley unclipped his holster. His hands shook as he removed his gun, his fingers barely able to grip it properly. With one final hesitation, he placed the weapon into Harris's outstretched hand. No sudden movements, no more mistakes, just surrender. The second officer stepped forward, motioning toward the door. "Come on, Crowley." Not Officer Crowley, not Sir, just Crowley. Because whatever authority he had once held, it was gone now. As he was led toward the door, he caught one last glimpse of Monica. She wasn't smirking, she wasn't gloating. She wasn't even satisfied. She simply stood tall, steady, unwavering, just as she had from the very beginning. Because this was never about revenge, it was about justice, and Crowley, for the first time in his life, was finally facing it. The night air outside the convenience store was thick with tension. The moment James Crowley stepped out, the flashing red and blue lights painted his face in sharp, unforgiving streaks. A crowd had already gathered, some drawn by the sirens, others by the buzz of a scandal unfolding in real time. Phones were everywhere, raised high, capturing every second of his downfall. Crowley felt the weight of their stares, the judgment in their eyes. His name was already being whispered among them, but by morning it wouldn't just be whispers. It would be headlines. Inside the store, Colonel Monica Lewis exhaled slowly, shaking her head. She wasn't angry. She wasn't even surprised. Just tired. Tired of seeing the same story play out over and over again. She took her time, walking back to the counter, reaching for the same money she had been pulling out before a gun had been pointed at her chest. The cashier stared at her, eyes still wide, her hands still trembling slightly. "I'm so sorry that happened to you," the young woman whispered. Monica gave her a small, knowing smile. "It's not the first time," she replied. And somehow that was the saddest part of all. She picked up her bottle of water and protein bar, nodding slightly before heading toward the exit. As she walked past the other customers, they watched her in stunned silence. Some still held their phones, recording even though the real event had already passed. Others just stared at her, as if trying to comprehend what they had just witnessed. She didn't stop to acknowledge them, because this wasn't about her. This was about the countless people who had been in her position and never got to walk away. The automatic doors slid open and the cool night air wrapped around her like an embrace. She paused at the threshold, looking out at the scene unfolding before her. James Crowley was being led toward a police car, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. He wasn't cuffed, yet, but the weight of what had happened was already shackled to him. He glanced up, his gaze meeting hers for just a second. There was no hatred in his eyes anymore, no anger, just something hollow. Regret. But regret wouldn't change what had happened. Regret wouldn't erase the fact that, had Monica been anyone else, someone without a uniform, without medals, without status, she might not be standing here at all. A sharp murmur from the crowd snapped Crowley's attention back to reality. A news van had pulled up, reporters stepping out, microphones in hand, ready to dissect the moment for the entire nation. By morning, his past complaints, the ones that had been ignored, buried, dismissed, would resurface. His name would be plastered across every news outlet, his face dissected in endless discussions about race, power, and bias in law enforcement. And he knew there was no way out of it. Monica took one last look at the scene before her. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away. Because this wasn't her battle to fight anymore. The truth had already won. The city would wake up to a scandal. By morning, the footage from inside the convenience store would be everywhere, on news broadcasts, social media, and endless debates about power, prejudice, and accountability. James Crowley's name would be spoken in disgust, his face frozen in the moment he had pointed his gun at an innocent woman. The world would see him not as a protector, but as a man who had let his fear and bias turn him into a villain. And Colonel Monica Lewis, the woman he had nearly killed over nothing, would become the face of yet another painful lesson America had failed to learn. As she walked away from the store, she didn't feel victorious. There was no satisfaction in seeing a man lose everything, even if he had deserved it. Because this wasn't just about him. It was about a system that had allowed him to operate unchecked for years. It was about the thousands of people who had been on the other side of a gun just like his and never got justice. It was about the ones who never made it home. Crowley had thought his badge made him untouchable, that his uniform gave him power beyond question, that he could act on his worst instincts and get away with it. But power without accountability always collapses. The store's automatic doors slid shut behind Monica as she stepped further into the night, her shoulders still squared, her steps still deliberate. Somewhere behind her, Crowley was being pulled further into the fallout of his actions. Somewhere ahead, people were watching the first clips of the incident go viral, and everywhere a conversation was beginning, one that had been had too many times before, yet never seemed to change anything. As Monica walked, she thought about the truth, how easily it could have been buried if there had been no cameras, how quickly her side of the story might have been dismissed if she weren't wearing a uniform, how dangerous it was that even she, a highly decorated officer who had risked her life for her country, wasn't safe from a split-second decision fueled by prejudice. She had spent her career defending freedom, justice, and the very system that had nearly failed her tonight. And yet, the saddest part was that she had expected it, because she had seen this happen too many times before. A cold wind swept through the street, rustling the edges of her uniform as she walked toward her car. The city buzzed around her, oblivious to what had just unfolded. For now. But by morning, everyone would know. By morning, the world would see what fear and unchecked power could do. By morning, Crowley's career, his carefully crafted image of authority, would be nothing more than a cautionary tale. And maybe, just maybe, this moment would be enough to save someone else. Because the truth always comes out, and some mistakes you just don't come back from. The night had settled into silence, but the echoes of what had happened inside that convenience store would ripple far beyond its doors. By sunrise, the world would know. The footage would spread across every screen, every social media platform, every news station. Discussions would explode, some calling for justice, others scrambling to defend the indefensible. But no matter how the story was spun, the truth was already out. James Crowley had drawn his gun on an innocent woman because of what he thought he saw, because of what he wanted to see. And Colonel Monica Lewis had survived, not because of justice, not because of the law, but because this time the cameras were rolling. That was the part that sat heaviest in her chest as she walked down the dimly lit sidewalk. Her grip tightening around the water bottle she had nearly lost her life over. Tonight she had lived. But how many others had not? How many times had there been no phones, no witnesses, no irrefutable proof? Monica knew the answer. Too many. Crowley had believed he had power, believed his badge made him invincible. And for years, maybe it had. Maybe in all those past encounters, in all those unspoken moments where his authority had gone unchecked, he had convinced himself that he was always right. But power without accountability always collapses. And tonight, the collapse had begun. As she reached her car, Monica paused, glancing back at the store one last time. The flashing red and blue lights bathed the parking lot in flickering shadows. The gathered crowd murmured in low voices, their gazes fixed on Crowley as he was escorted toward a squad car. He wasn't in handcuffs yet, but the weight on his shoulders was unmistakable. His career was over. His name would be dragged through the news, his past complaints resurfaced, his decisions dissected in endless debates about law enforcement and racial bias. His family, his colleagues, his entire world, everything he had built on a foundation of unchecked power, was crumbling. And he knew it. His eyes flickered toward Monica as he was guided past the cameras, past the people who no longer saw him as the authority figure he had once pretended to be. For a split second, she thought she saw something different in his face. Not anger, not hatred. Something hollow, something that almost looked like regret. But regret didn't change the past. Regret didn't erase the fact that had Monica been anyone else, someone without rank, without medals, without a uniform, this night could have ended very differently. That was the bitter truth. That was the real problem. She exhaled slowly, shaking her head before opening her car door. This was never just about her. This was about a system that allowed people like Crowley to exist unchecked for far too long. A system that only seemed to hold people accountable after their mistakes were caught on camera. She slid into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel with steady hands. This time the truth had won. But next time the cameras might not be there. And that was what scared her the most.